Compared to what they've had the past couple years, the Chicago Bulls are actually having a decent offseason so far. They traded an injury-prone Lonzo Ball to the Cavs in exchange for a 24-year-old defensive beast in Isaac Okoro, and they also signed 25-year-old guard Tre Jones to a surprisingly friendly 3-year $25 million deal. Most notably, with the 12th overall pick in the 2025 NBA Draft, the Bulls landed French forward Noa Essengue, who's still kinda raw, but whose long-term upside is projected to be comparable with that of modest Buzelis. While those moves are far from game-changing, they're actually the types of decisions that could pay dividends for this franchise in the long run. Though, moving on to the bad part of their offseason, the Bulls still couldn't find a trade partner with whom to offload the contract of Nikola Vucevic, who is overpaid for his age, as well as Patrick Williams, who's also overpaid for his production, neither of whom seems to fit Chicago's long-term plans. But the Bulls' potentially bigger screw-up this offseason could lie within how they've been dealing with the Josh Giddey contract situation. Well, there's no question as to where Josh Giddey will play next season. He is a restricted free agent, which means Chicago can match any deal offered to him by another team. But at this point in the summer we're in, cap space around the NBA has pretty much already dried up. Giddey and the Bulls are basically left alone at the negotiation table, with the Australian guard reportedly chasing a deal worth $30 million a year, while the Bulls reportedly want to settle for an amount closer to just $20 million annually. Well, sure, at first glance, Giddey is a ball-dominant point guard who came into Chicago with a shaky jumper and who was basically shipped off by Sam Presti to polish off the OKC Thunder's championship roster. But on the other hand, at 6'8" and still just 22 years old, Giddey is one of the most gifted playmakers in the entire NBA, who happens to also be super productive. In fact, he joined Nikola Jokic and Luka Doncic as the only 3 players in the NBA to average at least 14 points, 8 rebounds, and 7 assists per game last season. Most notably, after the Bulls shipped off Zach Lavine during the trade deadline, Giddey was given more control of the team's offense, which resulted to him averaging a near triple-double with 21 points, 10 rebounds, and 9 assists, together with 1.5 steals per game on a highly efficient 62% true shooting after the All-Star break, which are basically Nikola Jokic-type stats. And those aren't just empty numbers, as Giddey's mid-season breakout has helped fuel Chicago's late-season surge that saw the team win 15 of their last 21 games of the year. This led the Bulls to the play-in tournament, and while they bowed down to the Miami Heat, Giddey still put up a 25-10 double-double in that play-in tournament loss. Sure, there are still questions as to whether or not Giddey could sustain that type of star-level production for a whole season, but obviously, it's not totally absurd for him to be demanding $30 million per year, especially when certain baselines have already been established around the NBA. Take Jabari Smith Jr. for example. This offseason, he was signed by the Houston Rockets to a 5-year, $122 million deal, which breaks down to around $24 million per year. At first glance, that might look like a gigantic contract for someone who's projected to be a 5th or even a 6th option for Houston next season. But looking at how his contract is structured, Smith will be making $27.4 million during the last year of his deal, which is in the 2031 season. And looking at how the salary cap threshold and financial aprons are projected to keep expanding over the next couple years, based on 10% annual cap increases, the non-taxpayer mid-level exemption is projected to already be at around $21 million for that 2031 season. Obviously, the mid-level exemption is usually something teams use to sign regular rotation bench players, which is why it's crazy that during the last year of his deal, Jabari Smith Jr. will be making just around $6 million more than the mid-level exemption. So, even if he ends up to be just a regular starting caliber forward at the very least, his $122 million deal will still look like a reasonable contract in the long run. But if in about 5 years' time, Smith Jr. emerges to become something like Chris Bosh, who was his usual comp back when Houston selected him 3rd overall in 2022, then that $122 million deal is definitely gonna look like a massive bargain for the Rockets. Now, this is when you can start to put Josh Giddey into the equation. Last season, Josh Giddey and Jabari Smith Jr. practically averaged the same number of minutes per game. And sure, as expected, given his role in Chicago, Giddey averaged more points, rebounds, and assists than the 6'10" Jabari Smith Jr. But then, Giddey also shot better from the field and from the three-point line with practically similar attempts per game. Even when you dive into the advanced stats, you'll see that even with higher usage, Giddey had a significantly higher PER and Bucks plus-minus rating, as well as slightly higher win shares. So if the Houston Rockets were able to pay Jabari Smith Jr. an average of around $24 million per year, the question is, why can't Chicago pay Josh Giddey more? To take it a little further, let's also look into the Jalen Suggs example. Suggs, just like Giddey, is also his team's starting point guard, and Orlando signed him to a 5-year, $150 million deal, which breaks down to $30 million per year, the same amount Giddey reportedly wants. Last season, on practically similar playing time, Jalen Suggs averaged just around 1.5 more points per game than Josh Giddey, but Giddey basically out-rebounded and out-assisted Suggs while also shooting significantly better both from the field and from the three-point line than him. And also, looking at the advanced numbers, Suggs had a slightly higher usage than Giddey, but again, Giddey dominates Suggs in metrics such as PER, BPM rating, as well as win shares. Sure, Jalen Suggs is a much better overall defender, but Giddey was still the overall better player on a not terribly different usage. So, considering Orlando paid Jalen Suggs $30 million per year as their team's 4th or even 5th option, I'm definitely not blaming Giddey for wanting that kind of value from Chicago as well. Again, we can tie this up with the league's cap situation. If Josh Giddey receives a hypothetical 5-year, $150 million deal, assuming 10% cap increases during the last year of his contract in the 2030 season, Giddey's salary will basically take up just a tiny 12.9% of Chicago's cap room, which I think will be a bargain for the type of player that Giddey can eventually become, especially if you project him to be at least a 3rd option for a Bulls playoff team. Sure, there are reasons why the Bulls might be hesitant to give in to Giddey's asking price. First of all, Chicago's front office have a ton of leverage in contract talks this summer, because again, at this point, even the Brooklyn Nets, who are the only team to enter the summer with max cap space, had already acquired Michael Porter Jr.'s massive contract, in addition to the team also drafting a number of guards, which makes them an unlikely suitor for Giddey. The Bulls front office might also be starting to believe that overpaying players, even the star caliber ones, might actually make those players untradeable in the long run, as has been the case with Zach Lavine. They also might be scared to pay for upside because of how the Patrick Williams situation has been playing out after they paid him $90 million for 5 years. But then I think there are easily a ton of indications that Josh Giddey is a different type of player. Sure, at this point, Giddey still isn't an all-star, but in my opinion, you could make a larger argument for why he might even be worth more than most people think. First off, Giddey is an unusually young player in this kind of situation. Despite already having 4 years of NBA experience, he still won't turn 23 until October, and yet has already recorded the 13th most triple-doubles among all active NBA players. And there's also the fact that he was a starting point guard for a 57-win OKC Thunder team. So I think Giddey's accomplishments to date on a rookie contract must be seen in the context of players who are usually at least a year or 2 years older by this point in their NBA careers. Well, sure, Giddey's pull-up game is still very limited and there are still questions about his three-point shot, but with that said, he shot a career-high 37.8% from deep last season, including a highly efficient 45.7% mark after the All-Star break on 4 attempts per game. If I were a Bulls fan, I'd probably be more concerned with his overdependence on his signature push shot inside the paint, but it's worth noting that in Chicago, Giddey's also started to display more eagerness in terms of dissecting defenses off the dribble, which enables him to go downhill and to score at the basket more often, which has resulted to Giddey converting a solid 66% of all his attempts at the rim since the All-Star break. Well, he's not a lockdown defender by any means, but with him coming into Chicago with a slightly bulkier frame, Giddey now looks more suited defending shifty guards and even some bigger wings than when he was in OKC. As part of his late season surge, Giddey's also displayed a renewed energy as an off-ball disruptor, using his quick hands and instincts, which has allowed him to average a career-best 1.2 steals per game last season, in addition to him also showing flashes of being a help side shot blocker. Add in the fact that Giddey is already one of the best rebounding guards in the NBA and already one of the best playmakers out there, especially for a 6'8" player, and Giddey should always allow Chicago to run a ton of interesting lineup combinations when he is on the floor. Well, Chicago doesn't have the ideal roster built around Giddey right now, but if Matas Buzelis is eventually going to develop into someone like Giannis Antetokounmpo, then Josh Giddey is exactly the type of point guard that can get him easy looks both in the half-court and in transition. Giddey is also exactly the type of passer you want if you want to take advantage of Noa Essenge's skill set as a hybrid forward and a transition attacker. Overall, surround Giddey with a couple more shooters and a big man who could be a constant lob threat, and I think Chicago could build something special. The problem is, if the Bulls continue to lowball Giddey throughout this negotiation process, Giddey could eventually just bet on himself and take the $11 million qualifying offer, which makes him an unrestricted free agent next offseason, and that is something that could pose huge risk for the Bulls front office. Sure, there's the possibility of Giddey playing mediocre next season, which could cause his stock to drop in the 2026 free agent market. This will then allow Chicago to re-sign him next summer for practically the same amount they're offering him right now. But then, if Giddey continues to double down on his production over the second half of last season, or if he takes an even bigger leap to all-star level, then the Bulls will definitely have to pay him much more than $30 million per year. Although, if the Bulls aren't comfortable doing that, they still have Giddey's bird rights, which they can use to their advantage in a potential sign-and trade next summer. But then, the worst-case scenario for Chicago is, even if they eventually decide to pay Giddey more than $30 million per year next summer, out of spite for what happened this offseason, Giddey could still take similar money and just sign with another team of his choice in free agency. And in the end, Chicago will have nothing to show for the Alex Caruso trade. Well, at the very least, Giddey definitely has to prove that he can become a more consistent defender and a real outside shooting threat. But aside from those, all indications point to him being that type of young, special, promising player that Chicago's never had for quite some time now. And the Bulls not being able to lock up Giddey to a long-term extension just puts them in jeopardy of losing a potential star as early as next offseason. But what do you think is a reasonable extension for Josh Giddey? Let me hear your thoughts in the comment section below, and again, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing as well. Again, this has been Real Balls, and I'll see you on the next one. Peace.